Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I wasn't even supposed to be there that night. My friend Mark had planned the camping trip weeks ago, but when his girlfriend bailed last minute, he dragged me into the plan. Come on, it's just one night in the woods to chill, roast some marshmallows and drink some beers. It'll be fun, he'd insisted. So against my better judgment, I agreed. One night. How bad could it be? We headed to Willow's Hollow, a forest reserve a few hours out of town, known for its dense trees and supposedly its legends. Mark loved that stuff, always talking about cryptids, paranormal events, creatures that lurked beyond the edge of the campfire light. I never took him seriously, but something about the hollow always gave me the creeps. The way the trees were gnarled and twisted like they were hiding secrets. It felt like a place where light couldn't reach, where sound got swallowed up and never made it back out. We set up our tent near a small clearing, far enough from the trails so we wouldn't be disturbed by any wandering hikers. By sunset, we had the fire going, and for the first few hours, it was just like any other camping trip, drinking, laughing, talking about dumb stuff from high school. By around midnight, the temperature dropped fast. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to ignore the chill that seemed to seep through my bones. Mark suggested we turn in, but I wanted one more beer to take the edge off. He shrugged and went to the tent, leaving me alone by the fire. That's when I heard it, the rustling in the trees, not like a squirrel or a raccoon. This was heavier, like something big moving between the trunks. I called out, figuring maybe a deer had wandered close. But the noise stopped as soon as I spoke. Silence. I chalked it up to the wind and took a long swig from my beer, trying to calm my nerves. But as I stared into the darkness, I felt it. A presence. The kind of feeling that makes your skin crawl, like you're being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, the fire casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the trees, but there was nothing there. Get a grip, man, I muttered to myself, tossing another log onto the fire. It wasn't until I turned back to face the flames that I saw them. Two glowing eyes staring at me from the tree line. Yellow, unblinking, and way too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. I froze, gripping my beer can so tightly that it crumpled in my hand. "Mark?" I called out, my voice shaky, eyes fixed on those glowing orbs. There was no response from the tent, and the eyes didn't move. They just stared. And then they were gone, like they'd never been there. 1 second staring right through me. The next, just blackness. I tried to wake Mark, shaking him until he finally grumbled and told me to knock it off. "Go to sleep, dude. You're just drunk and freaking yourself out," he mumbled, rolling over. And maybe he was right. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I climbed into my sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easy. Every noise, every whisper of the wind had my eyes darting around the tent. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off into a restless slumber. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Early morning, maybe. It was still pitch black outside, but something pulled me from my sleep. A noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the side of the tent. Tap, 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 like someone gently running their fingers along the fabric. "Mark, wake up," I hissed, nudging him hard, but he was dead asleep, snoring softly. The tapping continued, slow, deliberate. I was too scared to move, but I had to know what it was. My hand trembled as I unzipped the tent just a tiny bit, just enough to peek outside. That's when I saw it. An impossibly tall figure standing just feet away from our tent. It was human-like, but wrong. The limbs were too long, the joints bent at odd angles. It wore something like a cloak, but it seemed to merge with its body, flowing in the breeze like shadows come to life. And then it tilted its head down, and I saw its face. No, not a face. There was nothing there. Just empty, hollow space where a face should have been. But I felt it staring, felt its eyes boring into me even without any features to show. I yanked the tent zipper shut, my breath coming in panicked gasps. "Mark, wake the hell up," I shouted, shaking him harder this time. He groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. What is it?" "There's something out there, man, something not human." He groaned, clearly not believing me, and unzipped the tent flap. "Look, dude, there's nothing." His voice cut off abruptly. I saw his face go pale, his eyes wide and terrified as he stared out into the dark. "What the hell?" he whispered, backing away from the opening. "See? I told you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it outside, the beam slicing through the night, but the figure was gone. Just the trees and our fire, now only smoldering embers. Mark was shaking, and I could see in his eyes that he finally believed me. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Now." We scrambled to pack our gear, tossing things into our bags without any care, just desperate to leave. That's when the laughter started. Low, deep chuckling that echoed through the trees, bouncing around us like a sickening game of hide-and-seek. We froze, and then we saw them, more figures stepping out from between the trees, surrounding our campsite. Each one was tall, distorted, with those cloaked bodies and featureless faces. And they were laughing, that horrid mocking laughter that made my blood run cold. One of them stepped closer, and my flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. I dropped it and grabbed Mark's arm. "Run!" I screamed, and we bolted through the forest, branches whipping our faces, roots clawing at our feet. The laughter followed us, growing louder, more distorted, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I don't know how long we ran. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed in agony, but I kept going, dragging Mark along, praying we'd find the car. Finally, we stumbled onto the dirt road where we'd parked and threw ourselves into the car. As I fumbled with the keys, Mark kept glancing out the window, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Come on, he urged. Finally, the engine roared to life, and we tore out of there, leaving the forest and its watchers behind. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. We didn't talk about what happened. We didn't have to. But here's the thing. I can't shake this feeling, like we were marked that night, watched. And sometimes in the dead of night, when everything is quiet, I hear it, a soft tapping at my window. Tap, tap, tap. And then that laughter, low, mocking, like it's coming from somewhere just out of sight, waiting for me to look. I've always loved camping. Something about the solitude, the scent of pine, and the chill of a campfire night always felt like an escape from reality. Last weekend was no different, or so I thought. My best friend Danny and I planned to spend 3 nights deep in Black Creek Forest, a sprawling wilderness known for its untouched beauty and its strangeness. People talked about the weird stuff out there, ghostly noises, animals moving in ways they shouldn't, things they couldn't explain. But honestly, I never believed those stories. They always felt like tall tales designed to keep kids from wandering too far. So when Danny suggested Black Creek, I didn't hesitate. The first day was uneventful. We hiked until our legs ached and set up camp by a narrow stream that glistened in the late afternoon sun. As night fell, we built a fire, cracked open some beers, and settled into the comforting sounds of nature. Crickets chirped, and the stream's gentle flow provided a steady backdrop to our laughter. We were miles from any civilization, a perfect place to unwind, or so we thought. Around midnight, the first unsettling moment happened. We were sharing ghost stories the way you do when you're half drunk in the woods, when we heard a noise in the distance, a low, guttural growl. Not the kind you'd expect from any normal animal. It was like a bear and a wolf tangled together, each trying to outdo the other in sheer menace. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking toward the darkness beyond our firelight. Danny shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Just an animal, man. We're in its home, remember?" but I could see it in his eyes. He was nervous. We tried to laugh it off, but my gut told me something wasn't right. That growl sounded close, too close, like it knew we were there, and it didn't like it. But after half an hour of nothing else happening, we went to our tents, still joking, still pretending it was all okay. I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m., and I had no idea why. The air felt different, still, heavy, like it was holding its breath. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside, and that's when I saw it. A tall silhouette just barely visible against the moonlight standing at the edge of our campsite. It was humanoid, but its limbs were all wrong. Long, too long, and its head was tilted like it was listening. My heart raced, and I held my breath, praying it wouldn't notice me. Then it moved, slowly, deliberately. It stepped closer to the firelight, and I saw its eyes, glowing amber, piercing the night, staring directly into my tent. I closed my eyes, hoping it would go away, and after what felt like an eternity, I opened them again. It was gone. The next morning I told Danny what I saw, but he brushed it off. "Man, you were dreaming, or drunk. Come on, let's go for a hike. Clear your head." I agreed, but something gnawed at the back of my mind. Those eyes, they were too real. The hike only made things weirder. The forest felt different that day. Off. Every tree seemed to lean toward us, like it was listening. Birds didn't sing, and the wind had an eerie whistle that sounded almost human. Halfway up the trail, Danny stopped suddenly, eyes wide. "What is it?" I asked, trying to follow his gaze. "Shh, did you hear that?" There it was again, a whisper, like someone murmuring just beyond the trees. But the words were garbled, twisted. We couldn't make them out. "Come on," Danny said, trying to sound brave, but I could see his hands shaking. We hurried back to camp, but that feeling of being watched never left. We agreed to pack up and leave the next morning, cutting our trip short. That night was worse, much worse. We tried to sleep, but the forest was alive with movement, branches snapping, leaves crunching, and the whispers. They were closer, circling our campsite. Around 2 a.m., I heard Danny whisper my name. Hey, get out here," he said, his voice low, almost trembling. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the glow of our fire, were several figures, tall, thin, with those same amber eyes I'd seen the night before. But there was something more disturbing. Their faces, they almost looked human. Almost. Like someone had taken a person's face and stretched it, twisted it into a permanent, unnatural grin. Is this some kind of joke?" Danny asked, his voice cracking. But I knew it wasn't. They were real, and they were getting closer. Then they spoke. The whispers turned into voices, garbled but recognizable. They sounded like us. "Danny, why don't you stay, play with us, forever?" It was my voice, my own voice coming from one of those twisted mouths. I grabbed Danny's arm. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted through the forest, our flashlights darting in every direction, but the beams couldn't pierce the darkness. The whispers followed us, mimicking our voices, laughing, taunting. We ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed for mercy. We finally stopped near a small clearing, trying to catch our breath. That's when we heard it, the sound of snapping branches, not behind us but in front. And then I saw Danny's eyes go wide with horror as he pointed. There, emerging from the trees, was me, another me, staring back, eyes glowing amber, and beside it, another Danny, a perfect copy but with those twisted, grinning faces. They moved in unison, mocking our every gesture, our every word. What is this?" Danny whispered, his voice breaking. Before I could answer, the copy of me lunged forward, its mouth gaping wide, wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of sharp, inhuman teeth. I screamed and turned to run, but Danny... Danny was frozen. I called his name, but he just stood there staring at the twisted version of himself, mouth agape. I ran. I didn't look back. Not until I reached my car, miles away from the campsite, breathless and shaking. I drove until I found cell service and called the police. They searched for days, but there was no sign of Danny or our campsite or any of our gear. It was like the forest swallowed it all whole. I wish I could say that's the end of it, but it's not. Last night, as I sat in my apartment, trying to convince myself it was all a nightmare, I heard it again. A whisper, garbled, twisted, and then, clear as day, my own voice, coming from just outside my window. Hey, why don't you play with us forever? I shouldn't have gone out there alone. Everyone warned me that the Devil's Hollow Forest wasn't a place for solo camping, but I didn't listen. Thought they were just trying to scare me. Ghost stories, legends about cryptids, skinwalkers, Dogman, they all sounded ridiculous. But that was before. Now those stories are all I think about. The forest was massive, stretching for miles without any trail markers. That's why I picked it. Complete isolation. I wanted to disconnect from everything, find myself in the silence of nature, and experience the raw thrill of being out there alone. I packed my backpack with the essentials, tent, food, flashlight, and a few other supplies, and headed into the woods one Friday afternoon, determined to prove to myself that I could handle it. For the first few hours, everything seemed perfect. The sun filtered down through the thick canopy of trees, painting the forest floor in golden hues. I followed a faint animal path until I reached a small clearing surrounded by pine and cedar trees, where I decided to set up my camp. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and damp moss. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. By the time I finished setting up, the sun had dipped low in the sky, and long shadows crept through the trees. I got a fire going, cooked some hot dogs, and settled into the solitude. And that's when I heard it. The first sound. It was like a twig snapping, followed by a soft rustle from deep within the woods. I froze, straining to listen, but heard nothing else. I chalked it up to deer or some other animal and pushed the thought out of my mind, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The light of the fire flickered and danced as the night set in. I found myself staring into the darkness between the trees, trying to make out shapes that probably weren't even there. That's when I noticed something odd. There were no forest sounds, no crickets, no birds, just the crackling of the fire and my own breathing. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Hours passed. I tried to convince myself everything was normal. I even told myself some of those ghost stories for a laugh, but each time I chuckled to myself, I swore I heard it echo back. Someone laughing along with me just out of earshot. I didn't feel like laughing anymore. At around midnight, when the fire was starting to die down, I heard it again. A crunching sound, closer this time, just beyond the glow of the flames. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it towards the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and dense underbrush. I panned it back and forth, but whatever had made the noise was hidden. And then I saw it, a pair of eyes, shining yellow, just for a split second before vanishing into the blackness. They were unnaturally high off the ground, like whatever was watching me was tall. I called out, trying to sound confident. "Who's there?" My voice sounded small, feeble, swallowed by the night. Silence answered. My heartbeat thudded in my ears and my hand shook as I gripped the flashlight. Then, just as I began to lower it, I heard footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate, circling me. Whatever it was staying just outside the edge of the firelight, close enough for me to hear, but far enough for me not to see. I swung the flashlight wildly, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there, but every time the light landed on a tree or bush, the sound would come from somewhere else. I don't know what came over me, but I started yelling, "Get away! I'm armed!" It wasn't true, but I was hoping to scare off whatever animal was out there. For a moment it worked. The forest went still, and the footsteps stopped. I took a breath and let the silence settle, and then from behind me I heard it. A soft, hoarse whisper. "Armed." I spun around, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. It repeated the word, "armed, armed," like it was testing it out, learning how to say it. My heart sank to my stomach. This wasn't an animal. It was something that could speak, something that understood, and it was mocking me. I knew I had to leave. I quickly started dousing the fire, packing my things with shaking hands, but as I crouched to stuff my sleeping bag into my backpack, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, a low, rumbling growl like a dog, but much deeper, and it was right behind me. I turned so quickly I lost my balance, falling back and dropping the flashlight. In the faint light of the dying fire, I saw it, a massive, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long and a head that seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally, like it couldn't decide on a shape. And the eyes, those same yellow eyes, locked onto mine. For a second, neither of us moved. Then it let out a guttural, bone-chilling laugh. It sounded like a dozen voices all at once, men, women, children, laughing together in a chorus. And then it spoke, in my voice. "Armed." It lunged towards me and I scrambled back, grabbing my flashlight and bolting towards the woods. I didn't care that I was running blindly. I just knew I had to get away. My feet pounded against the ground as I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping against my face, tearing at my clothes. But the footsteps followed, heavy and fast, never far behind. I didn't dare look back. It felt like I ran for hours. The forest twisted and turned, and I was sure I was going deeper into it rather than out. But then, through the darkness, I saw it. Light. The road. My car. I sprinted towards it, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air. I reached my car, fumbling for my keys, and practically dove inside, locking the doors behind me. I slammed the key into the ignition, my hands trembling so badly it took 3 tries before the engine roared to life. I floored it, peeling out onto the road, and I didn't look back until I was miles away. When I finally did, I saw it standing at the edge of the forest, just standing there, watching. A tall, dark silhouette with glowing yellow eyes. And it did one last thing before I lost sight of it. It raised its hand, a long, spindly hand, and waved, a mocking human wave. I don't know what it was, but I've never gone back to those woods. Every once in a while, when I'm alone in my apartment at night, I hear the sound of soft laughter, like a faint echo. And sometimes in the corner of my eye, I think I see those yellow eyes just for a moment, watching. And the worst part, every time I tell this story, that whisper comes back to me. Armed. And then the laughter follows. The fire crackled softly in front of me, sending sparks up into the cool night air. The towering pines around the clearing loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a break from the chaos of city life. Just me, the trees, and the stars. But something felt wrong. It started earlier that afternoon. I'd been hiking for most of the day, making my way deeper into the heart of Blackwood Forest. It wasn't a well-traveled area, which is exactly what I wanted. I'd heard stories about people getting lost here, about strange occurrences, but I chalked it up to local legends meant to scare tourists. After all, forests are full of noises. Creatures scurry through the underbrush, branches snap, the wind howls through the trees. It's easy to let your imagination run wild. But this was different. I first noticed the silence. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. It wasn't just the absence of birds or animals. It was like the forest itself had stopped breathing. The usual sounds of nature, the wind, the leaves, the occasional rustle, were gone. It felt unnatural, and with it came a sensation I couldn't quite place, a feeling like I was being watched, not by an animal, but by something intelligent, something that understood I was there, alone. By the time I found a clearing to set up camp, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The sky had taken on that eerie twilight glow, where the light is just enough to see, but the shadows seemed darker, more oppressive. As I started building my fire, that sense of unease deepened. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was psyching myself out. But then, I saw it. Just beyond the tree line, something moved. It was quick, almost too fast for me to register, but I caught a glimpse. A shape, human-like, but not quite right. It disappeared as quickly as it had come, slipping behind the trees before I could focus on it. I froze, staring at the spot where it had vanished, my heart thudding in my chest. Was it just a trick of the light? Maybe an animal? A deer? Or a bear? But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen wasn't either of those things. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my hands were shaking as I finished setting up camp. The fire eventually took hold, the flames casting flickering light against the darkening woods. I felt a little better with it burning in front of me, but that nagging sense of being watched never left. As the night wore on, the feeling only grew stronger. It was around midnight when the first sound came, a low, distant call, like something was trying to speak through the trees. At first I thought it was the wind, but it didn't ebb and flow like a breeze. It was too deliberate, too steady. I sat up, staring into the darkness, straining my ears to hear. There it was again, soft, guttural, like a voice carried on the wind. It sounded almost human, but wrong, distorted. "Hello?" I called out, more out of reflex than anything else. My voice sounded small, fragile against the vast, looming forest. The noise stopped, and for a moment I thought I might have scared it off. But then a new sound reached my ears. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. They crunched through the underbrush, circling the edge of my camp just beyond the light of the fire. I grabbed my flashlight, heart racing, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped as soon as the light hit the area, but the sensation of being watched intensified. I scanned the perimeter, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Who's there?" I shouted. No answer, just the sound of the fire crackling and my own ragged breathing. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the trail back to my car was long, and hiking in the dark didn't seem like a smart move, especially with whatever was out there. I decided to stay by the fire, hoping that whatever it was would lose interest. But the forest wasn't done with me yet. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of something, or someone, moving just outside my tent. It was a soft shuffling, like bare feet against leaves. My heart leapt into my throat. I reached for the flashlight, but as I flicked it on, the sound stopped again. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make any noise. When I poked my head out, the fire had nearly burned down to embers. The forest was still, but the feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. I shined the flashlight around the campsite, its beam cutting through the shadows. And then I saw it. Standing just beyond the tree line, maybe 30 feet away, was a figure. It looked human, but its posture was all wrong, too tall, too thin. Its limbs elongated in a way that made my skin crawl. Its face. God, its face was pale and expressionless, like a mask. I froze, unable to breathe, unable to move. The figure stood there, perfectly still, watching me. It didn't blink, didn't move, just stared with those empty, hollow eyes. I felt my blood turn to ice. For what felt like hours, we stayed like that, locked in a silent, terrifying standoff. Then, without warning, it stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I couldn't. I sat by the fire, keeping it alive, my back to the tent, staring into the trees. Every rustle, every snap of a twig set my heart racing. But I didn't see it again. By the time dawn broke, I was already packing up. I wasn't going to stay another minute in that place. As I slung my pack over my shoulders and started down the trail, I glanced back at the clearing one last time. That's when I saw the tracks. Bare, human-like footprints leading from the edge of the tree line directly to where my tent had been. But the thing that chilled me to the bone, the tracks didn't lead away, they just stopped, as if whatever had been watching me had vanished into thin air. I hiked out of that forest as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the parking lot. When I got there, the same ranger I'd spoken to when I arrived was waiting by the trailhead. "Didn't expect you back so soon," he said with a curious look. "Something scare you off?" I didn't say anything, just shook my head and kept walking. But as I reached my car, he called out again. "Be careful out there next time," he said, his voice oddly flat. "The woods, they don't like to be disturbed." When I turned back to look at him, he was gone. No sign of him, no vehicle, nothing. I've heard stories since then about Blackwood Forest, about strange figures, about people who go missing and are never found. I've never been back, and I never will. I arrived at Black Hollow Campground just before dusk. The sun dipped low behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the dense forest that bordered the site. The place was abandoned for the season, except for me, the lone ranger left to close up the grounds for the winter. I'd spent years out here, patrolling the trails and making sure campers followed the rules. But tonight, something felt off. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that seemed too cold for October. As I walked through the empty camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest had a way of playing tricks on your mind. The rustling leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot. Innocent sounds that, out here, could feel like they had intent behind them. I chalked it up to fatigue. After all, it had been a long week, and I was ready for the quiet. I made my way to the ranger station, a small cabin nestled at the far end of the campground. The windows were fogged from the cold, and the inside was dimly lit by a single lantern I had left behind that morning. I set my pack down and grabbed the walkie-talkie, ready to check in with the base. Ranger McCall checking in, all quiet on the east end, just wrapping things up for the season. There was a brief crackle of static before a response came through. "Copy that, McCall. Stay safe out there. I've heard reports of strange activity in the area lately. Could be some wildlife, but just keep an eye out. Over." "Will do," I replied, though the mention of strange activity had me on edge. The sun was nearly gone now, leaving the forest in a thick, inky darkness. I settled into the station, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my bones. Just one more night out here, I reminded myself. I'd be back in town by morning, away from the isolation and quiet that suddenly felt far too heavy. As I sat down with a cup of coffee, something outside caught my eye, a flicker of movement just beyond the tree line. My pulse quickened. I leaned forward, squinting through the foggy window, but saw nothing. Probably a deer, I thought. This deep in the woods, it wasn't unusual to spot wildlife after dark. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. I stood and grabbed my flashlight, stepping out into the cold night air. The trees were still, their branches barely swaying in the faint breeze. I swept the beam of light across the clearing, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, listening intently. It was too slow, too deliberate to be natural. My first thought was someone had stayed behind. Maybe a straggler who hadn't gotten the memo that the campground was closed. But I knew that was unlikely. The place had been empty for days. No one should have been here. I called out, "Hello, anyone out there?" No response, just the tapping, continuing in its eerie, unhurried cadence. My flashlight swept the trees again, and for a brief moment I saw something. A figure standing still between the trunks, barely visible in the shadows. "Hey!" I shouted, taking a step forward. The figure didn't move. My heart was pounding now, and I took another step toward the trees, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The tapping stopped. Silence fell over the woods, thick and suffocating. I shined the light where I had seen the figure, but it was gone. The air around me felt heavier, colder. The wind seemed to die, leaving the forest unnaturally still. I could feel the sweat trickling down my neck despite the chill, every instinct screaming at me to go back inside the station. But something pulled me forward, a curiosity maybe, a need to know what I had seen. I pushed into the woods, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the trees as I went. Every step felt like a mistake, but I couldn't turn back. Not yet. I followed the path for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes, until I reached a small clearing. And there, in the middle of the clearing, was something I didn't expect. A campsite. But this wasn't a part of the Black Hollow grounds. The tent was old, weathered, and collapsed, as if it hadn't been used in years. Gear was scattered around, untouched and rotting, like whoever had set up camp here had just vanished. I knelt down, inspecting the area. The fire pit was cold, and the tent had been shredded, not by animals, but by something else. Claw marks streaked across the canvas, deep and ragged. My stomach tightened, and I stood quickly, turning to leave. That's when I heard it again, the tapping. But this time it was behind me, and I whipped around, shining the flashlight wildly through the trees, but there was nothing. The tapping continued, louder now, more insistent. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the area, my skin crawling with fear. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dark, stood the figure. It was closer this time, tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its face, if you could call it that, was featureless, a pale mask in the moonlight. My blood turned to ice. The tapping grew louder. It wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It was coming from it. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, unable to process what I was seeing. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into darkness. The tapping stopped. For a long moment there was silence, and then a voice. "McCall," it whispered, barely audible but unmistakable. My name, spoken in a raspy, inhuman tone. I ran. I sprinted back through the trees, branches slashing at my arms and face as I tore through the undergrowth. I didn't dare look back, didn't stop until I burst through the door of the ranger station, slamming it behind me and locking it tight. I collapsed into the chair, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. What the hell had I just seen? The radio on the table crackled to life, and I grabbed it, my hand shaking. "McCall, you there?" Jeff's voice came through, clear and concerned. I'm here," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "Something's out here, Jeff. Something in the woods." There was a long pause, and then Jeff's voice, quiet and serious. "Get out of there, McCall, now. I don't know how to tell you this, but we just got a call. They found your truck. Crashed hours ago. You're not supposed to be there." I stared at the radio, heart pounding in my ears. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I'm here. I'm in the station." The line went dead, and behind me, in the suffocating silence of the cabin, I heard it. Tap, 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 right outside the door. I've worked as a park ranger in Ashwood National Forest for about 5 years now. It's a quiet place, out of the way, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where the trees grow thick and the fog rolls in like a blanket every evening. Most days the job is peaceful, boring even, but I don't mind. I like the solitude, the quiet, the way the forest seems to stretch on forever, untouched by time. That changed last fall. I was stationed in a small outpost about 20 miles from the nearest town, responsible for keeping an eye on the backcountry trails. These trails were barely used, too remote, too dangerous. But every once in a while, hikers would come through, drawn by the challenge or the beauty of the untouched wilderness. It was my job to make sure they didn't get lost, or worse. One chilly October afternoon, I got a call about a missing camper, a guy in his late 20s, traveling alone. He hadn't checked in for a few days, and his family was getting worried. He'd last been seen near a place called Stone Hollow, a part of the forest that most locals avoid. There's a reason for that. Stone Hollow has a reputation, an old legend passed down by the mountain folk. They say it's cursed, that something dark lives there. People talk about strange lights, unnatural sounds, and figures moving through the trees. Things that aren't quite human. I've heard the stories, everyone around here has, but I didn't put much stock in them. I've spent years in these woods and never seen anything I couldn't explain. So, when I got the call, I geared up and set out, figuring it would be a routine search. I'd find the guy probably lost or injured, and we'd head back to the station by nightfall. It didn't turn out that way. The trail to Stone Hollow is rugged, winding through dense forest and over jagged cliffs. The sun was already low in the sky by the time I got close, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves heavy in the breeze. I radioed in my location, then started down the path that would take me into the hollow. Almost immediately I noticed something was off. The forest was too quiet, no birds, no animals. Just the sound of my boots crunching through the leaves. I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. About a mile in, I found the camper's tent. It was collapsed, the fabric torn in places like something had ripped it apart in a hurry. There was no sign of him. No blood, no tracks. Nothing. That's when I heard the first noise. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A low guttural hum, like a distant engine or the buzz of 1,000 insects. But there was something unnatural about it, something that made my skin crawl. I turned, shining my flashlight through the trees, but saw nothing. I was about to call it in when I heard the whispering. At first I thought it was the wind, rustling through the branches. But then the words became clear, though I couldn't understand them. It was a language I didn't recognize, spoken in hushed, hurried tones. It was coming from deeper in the hollow. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave. But I pressed on, telling myself it was just my imagination, that the missing camper had probably gotten disoriented and was somewhere nearby. The further I went, the louder the whispering became, until it was all around me, echoing through the trees. The path narrowed, leading me down into a depression surrounded by jagged rocks and gnarled, twisted trees. The air here was colder, the mist thicker, and in the center of the hollow stood a large, crumbling stone formation, a ring of ancient, moss-covered rocks that looked like they'd been placed there by someone, or something. That's when I saw him. The missing camper was standing in the middle of the stone circle, his back to me. He was motionless, his head bowed, arms hanging limply at his sides. Relief flooded through me, and I called out to him. He didn't respond. I called again, louder this time, stepping closer. Still nothing. I was maybe 10 feet away when I noticed the smell, an overwhelming stench of rot like something long dead. My gut tightened, and I slowed my approach. "Hey," I called cautiously. "Are you okay?" He moved then, but not like a person should. His head snapped up, too fast, like a puppet yanked on a string. He turned toward me, and that's when I saw his face. It wasn't him, not really. His eyes were wide, too wide, and black, completely black like pools of ink. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. They weren't human, they weren't alive. I stepped back, my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the thing that was once the camper. Slowly, his mouth began to move, but the words that came out weren't his own. They were the same whispers I'd heard in the trees, the same unrecognizable language, spoken in a voice that was not his. The air grew thick, heavy with an unseen presence. The trees around me seemed to close in, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes, their bark darkening as if soaked in shadows. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and I could feel something moving through the trees. I didn't see it, but I felt it. something watching me, something hungry. The camper took a step toward me, his limbs jerky, unnatural, his black eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I realized what the locals had meant. Stone Hollow wasn't just cursed, it was alive, or rather, something inside it was, something ancient, and it had claimed him. I finally found my legs and stumbled back, turning and running as fast as I could. The whispers followed me, growing louder, closer, until I could feel them brushing against my skin like icy fingers. I didn't stop until I was halfway back to the outpost, breath ragged, chest tight with fear. When I finally reached the station, I radioed in, but I didn't tell them everything. Just that I hadn't found the camper, that he was likely lost or injured, and that we'd need a search team to go out the next day. I didn't mention the stone circle. I didn't mention the whispers or the black eyes. I didn't tell them about the way the forest had seemed to come alive, or the presence I felt out there in the hollow. Because I knew they wouldn't believe me. I barely believed it myself. But I never went back to Stone Hollow. A search team went out the next day, combed the area for 3 days straight, and found nothing. No tent, no tracks, no camper. It was like he'd never been there. But I know the truth. I know what lives out there, waiting in the mist and the shadows, whispering through the trees. And I'll never go back. Because whatever claimed him is still there, and it's waiting for someone else to wander too deep into the hollow. Waiting to take them too. The fire crackled softly as I poked at it with a long stick, watching the embers shift beneath the logs. It was just me, alone in the middle of a remote campground deep in the woods. I had driven up here to escape the noise of the city for the weekend, a break from the ceaseless hum of life. I'd found the campground online. It seemed perfect, isolated, tucked away from the main trails, and barely visited. I wanted solitude. But now, sitting in the eerie silence of the forest, I wasn't so sure. The trees towered around me, dark shadows against the dying light of dusk. I could barely make out the outline of the trail that led back to where my car was parked, a good mile away. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived that morning. As the night fell, the forest felt like it was closing in. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and somewhere far off, an owl hooted. I chuckled to myself, trying to shake off the nervous energy building in my chest. It's just your imagination, I thought. Being alone does strange things to the mind. After eating a quick dinner and feeding the fire some fresh wood, I settled into my tent for the night. The only sounds now were the crackling of the fire and the occasional whisper of the wind. For a while, I lay there staring up at the nylon roof of the tent, listening to the sounds of the woods, my thoughts drifting. But then I heard it, a sharp snap, a branch breaking maybe 50 yards away. My heart thudded in my chest, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I strained my ears, waiting, holding my breath. Nothing, just the wind. I shook my head. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I was in the middle of a forest after all. I settled back down, telling myself to stop being ridiculous, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. There was something off about this place, something that hadn't felt right since I first arrived. The kind of silence that isn't natural, the feeling that the trees themselves were watching. I pushed the thought away and closed my eyes. Another snap, closer this time. My eyes flew open and I listened, every nerve on edge. The sound was unmistakable, footsteps, deliberate, moving through the underbrush toward my campsite. I sat up, fumbling for my flashlight, my pulse hammering in my ears. I clicked it on and shone the beam through the mesh of the tent. The fire outside flickered dimly, casting long shadows over the trees. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding weak in the silence. "Is someone there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. I swallowed hard and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The fire had died down, its warmth barely reaching me. I scanned the darkness, shining the beam of my flashlight over the trees, the bushes, the trail. Nothing. No sign of anyone or anything. I stood there for a long time, my breath clouding in front of me, every muscle tensed. But after a while, the woods fell silent again, save for the wind. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it wasn't. I threw a few more logs onto the fire, watching as the flames leapt back to life, casting their light around the campsite. I told myself I was overreacting, letting the isolation get to me. Still, I stayed outside for a while, keeping an eye on the trees, waiting for the sound to return. It didn't. Eventually, I crawled back into the tent, leaving the fire burning brighter this time. I lay there, heart still pounding, but exhaustion was beginning to win out over fear. My eyelids grew heavy, and I started to drift. Then the whispering started. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but this was different. Soft, hushed voices, just outside the tent. Too low to make out, but unmistakably there, circling my campsite. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, frozen in place. The voices weren't human, or if they were, they weren't speaking any language I recognized. It was a strange, garbled whisper, like something from a dream. I didn't move. I couldn't move. Then the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, moving closer and closer to the tent. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't dare turn it on this time. Somehow I knew I didn't want to see whatever was out there. The footsteps circled around me, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The air inside the tent felt thick, suffocating. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop, for the night to end, for anything to make this nightmare go away. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the voices and footsteps stopped. Silence. I stayed there, rigid, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. No more footsteps, no more whispers, just the crackling of the fire outside. It was hours before I dared move. When I finally did, I crawled out of the tent again, flashlight in hand. The air felt different now, colder, heavier. The trees loomed darker than before, like they were hiding something just beyond the reach of the light. That's when I saw it. Something was carved into the trunk of the tree just behind my tent. Symbols. Strange, twisting symbols that hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped as I traced the lines with my eyes, my skin crawling. Suddenly the whispering came back, louder this time, closer. I spun around, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand, but there was no one there. I knew in that moment I had to leave. I didn't care if it was the middle of the night. I didn't care about packing up the tent. I had to get out of there. But as I turned toward the trail, I froze. Standing there just at the edge of the light was a figure. Dark, shadowed, its features impossible to make out. But I could feel it staring at me, watching. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The figure wasn't standing in the light. It was part of the shadows. It wasn't something separate from the darkness. It was the darkness. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, heart racing. The thing didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, waiting. And then, without warning, it stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, threw open the door, and sped down the dirt road, not looking back once. When I finally got home, I collapsed onto my couch, still shaking, my mind racing. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the light, just my imagination. But then I remembered the symbols on the tree, the whispers. And then, as I reached into my pocket, I pulled out my phone. I hadn't realized I had taken a picture of the campsite earlier that evening, before everything went wrong. My heart stopped as I looked at the image. There, in the background of the photo, barely visible in the fading light, was the figure, standing between the trees. It had been watching me the whole time. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend, just me and my girlfriend Hannah out in the woods, away from everything. We needed this trip, something to clear our heads, to get us back on track. Lately, Life had been weighing us down, the stress, the arguments, the distance creeping in like a slow poison. This was meant to fix that. We picked a spot far from any other campsites, isolated on the edge of a dense, sprawling forest. It was the kind of place where the world felt untouched, ancient. You could feel the weight of the years in the air, thick and still, almost like time itself had forgotten this place. It was perfect. The first day was uneventful. We set up the tent, gathered firewood, and cooked dinner as the sun dipped low, casting the woods in a warm, orange glow. For the first time in weeks, we laughed. It felt good, normal. I started to believe this trip might actually fix things between us. That night, though, things started to get strange. It was around midnight when I woke up. The fire outside just embers, casting flickering shadows against the tent. Hannah was still asleep beside me, her breathing soft and steady. But something had stirred me, some sound just beyond the thin walls of the tent, a low rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I strained to listen, my heart beating faster. At first, I thought it might just be a deer, or maybe the wind moving the leaves. But the sound was too deliberate, too human. I sat up, careful not to wake Hannah, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The forest was dark, the moon barely lighting the tops of the trees. At first I didn't see anything, just the silhouettes of the trees and the faint glow of the dying fire. But then, from the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A shape, low to the ground, moving slowly through the bushes at the edge of the clearing. It was too dark to make out details, but the way it moved, it wasn't right. It didn't walk, it slithered. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I stared at the spot where I had seen it. But whatever it was had disappeared, melting into the blackness of the trees. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably just an animal. I zipped the tent back up and laid down, pulling Hannah closer. But sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning I mentioned it to Hannah, but she just shrugged it off. It's the woods, babe. There are animals everywhere. She was probably right. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but that unease lingered in the back of my mind all day. We spent the day hiking deeper into the forest. The trees here were massive, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands reaching out to block the sun. There was something oppressive about the woods the further in we went, the kind of silence that pressed in on you from all sides, like the world was holding its breath. The strangest part, though, was how we never saw anyone else. Not a single hiker, not even a distant trail. This place was completely empty, like we were the only ones left in the world. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was setting again, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and warp the landscape. The fire crackled to life as I lit it, and for a moment, things felt normal again. We cooked dinner, drank some wine, and sat by the fire, talking and laughing like nothing had happened the night before. But when the fire started to die down, that feeling returned, that oppressive silence, that sense of being watched. I kept glancing into the trees, expecting to see movement, to see that shape from the night before. But there was nothing, just the dark, endless forest. We decided to turn in for the night, and I tried to push the unease to the back of my mind. But as soon as we crawled into the tent, I knew something was wrong. The air inside felt wrong. It smelled faintly of earth, damp and decaying. At first I thought it was just the forest, but it was too strong, too close. I turned to Hannah, but she had already drifted off, her back to me. I wanted to wake her, to tell her that something felt off, but I didn't. I didn't want to seem paranoid, to ruin the trip we so desperately needed. Then I heard it again, the rustling. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was inside the tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, like something shifting beneath the fabric of the tent floor. I reached out slowly, my hand trembling as I pressed it against the floor. I could feel something moving underneath, a slow, subtle writhing like something alive was buried just beneath us. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled my hand back, trying not to make a sound. I turned to shake Hannah awake, but when I touched her shoulder, she didn't stir. "Hannah?" I whispered, my voice shaking. No response. I shook her again, harder this time. "Hannah!" She rolled over, her eyes closed, her face pale and slack. My stomach dropped. Her skin was ice cold. I scrambled out of the sleeping bag, grabbing the flashlight. I shined it on her, my hands trembling, my mind racing. She was breathing, but barely. Her skin was covered in a thin layer of dirt, like she'd been lying in the ground. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. I shook her again, harder. "Hannah, wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, but they weren't. Right. They were dull, lifeless, like she wasn't really seeing me. Then, slowly, her mouth opened. "Get out," she whispered, her voice flat, mechanical. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind spinning. What are you—" "Get out," she repeated, her voice more urgent now, her eyes locking onto mine. But they weren't Hannah's eyes anymore. Something else was looking at me through them, something ancient and cold. Before I could move, she sat up, her movements stiff, unnatural. The dirt on her skin began to crack and fall away, revealing something dark and slick underneath, something that wasn't human. I scrambled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the tent, and I fell hard against the ground outside. As I lay there gasping for breath, I saw her crawl out of the tent, her limbs contorting, twisting into unnatural angles. That's when I realized this wasn't Hannah anymore. It never had been. Not since last night. The thing wearing her skin tilted its head, staring at me with those hollow eyes, its mouth twisting into a grotesque smile, and then it spoke in a voice that was no longer hers. "She's with us now. You should have left." I didn't stay to hear anything else. I ran, deeper into the forest, the thing's laughter echoing behind me. And now as I sit here writing this, I can still hear it in the distance. It's coming for me. I don't think I'll make it out of these woods. But if you ever find this, don't go looking for her. Don't go looking for me.